Chapter 18 of Workers Together. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Workers Together, or An Endless Chain, by Pansy. Chapter 18. Father's Friend. Mr. Cady was in his private office, and his cashier was with him. Both gentlemen looked perplexed. "It is a very extraordinary circumstance to occur in our business," Mr. Cady was saying, as he passed his hand across his forehead in a weary way, and looked as though he did not approve of extraordinary circumstances. The cashier's pale face flushed. He knew perfectly well that this was a polite way of saying, "Mr. Wilson, I am perfectly astonished at you for allowing such a thing to occur." "I cannot account for it, sir," he said. Of course my attention was called at once to the counterfeit note, and I made immediate note of the fact that it came up in Parks's basket, and so reported it. It did not at once occur to me that perhaps accounts would balance without the bad note. Why should it? True enough, but it is always well to get at one's balance sheet as soon as possible after an error has been discovered. And in point of fact, no statement should have been made to the young man until this was done. As it is, the clerks are all aware of a disturbance, I suppose? Yes, sir. He was, unfortunately, so much excited when he came to you that he talked very loud. And besides, such things leak out, one hardly knows how. This statement made Mr. Cady twist uneasily in his chair. He had been very much annoyed with his young clerk's manner. He remembered now that he had been a good deal annoyed by some other matters, and he wondered whether his voice had been loud. It was altogether a new phase of business to the successful merchant. "I regret it exceedingly," he said to the cashier. "The more so because the young man has been sick and is easily excited. It is quite as great a mystery as before, but it looks as though he might not be to blame. In fact, I may say I have no doubt but that he speaks the exact truth. But I want this thing searched out. If we have any one in our employ who is slipping counterfeit notes into our hands for the purpose of learning whether we are sharp enough to detect them, it is desirable that we should know who he is." Mr. Wilson hesitated, feeling in doubt as to whether his thought might not be better left unspoken. "You have no fears of his being tempted in that way?" he said inquiringly. "You see, sir, the note came up with his basket. I am certain of that, and I don't know how to account for it." "Well, what now?" It was Mr. Cady's voice, and was a somewhat ungracious response to a knock at the door. He was in no mood for interruptions. The knocking, which was of a timid character, continued, and must receive attention. "Just see who that is, if you please, and say that I am engaged." Thus ordered, Mr. Wilson attended to the door, while his chief sat back in his chair and gave himself up to troubled thought. He was roused by the earnestness of a young voice. "Oh, if you please, couldn't you let me just speak 3 words to him? I'll talk awful fast, and there isn't much to say. Only he is father's friend, he is, and held the cup of water that helped him so, and I can't have him go to jail, not if I went myself, and I didn't mean no harm." "What are you talking about?" Mr. Wilson said impatiently. "Don't I tell you he is very busy and cannot be interrupted?" "I'm talking about Mr. Robert Parks, if you please, father's friend and the doctor's friend. He didn't do nothing wrong, and I'm going to tell all about it, whatever happens to me." So much Mr. Cady heard before he arose and went to the door. "Come in," he said, "and close the door. Now who are you, and what is this all about?" "I'm Thomas Riley," the mite said, trying to keep his voice from trembling. "I'm a cash boy. Dr. Everett got me the place. You said I was too little, but you would try me. I'll tell you all about the note, sir. It was my father give it to me, because I never had no paper money in my life before. And I knew this wasn't money, only just to make believe. You see the way it was. 3 men paid father for a lot of work on the very same day. He waited weeks and weeks, and then they all took it in their heads to pay him at once. And there were 2 notes, and they, both of them, looked nice and right. But one of them wasn't good for nothing. Every one of the men said that they did not give it, but father knew they did, and he said he would make them sweat for it if he knew which one it was. But he had to lose it, and he give it to me to play I had money, and I brought it to the store. Bad luck to me for doing that. But I didn't mean no harm. I had it out, looking at it, but I dared not show it to the fellows. Father said I must not, because they would think I wanted to pass bad money. I was looking at it when Mr. Parks, my father's friend, he called my number sharp-like, and sent me up to the desk, and told me to step spry, and somebody else called me right afterwards, and business was awful brisk for a few minutes. And when I had a chance to look for my money, I had tucked it up my sleeve to keep it safe, it was gone. I took off my jacket and turned it inside out, but I couldn't find the thing nowhere. When I heard the fuss about the note, I says to myself, it went and dropped into one of them baskets that I took up, that's what it did. And I was scared. But I didn't mean no harm, and I made up my mind to just keep still. But when I found out that it was Mr. Robert, who is my father's friend, that had got into trouble by it, I couldn't do that nohow, and I made up my mind to speak out if I did have to go to jail. I didn't mean no harm. It would be impossible to give you an idea of how pitiful, and at the same time how comical, poor Thomas looked as he stood, with red face and eager trembling voice, before the great man and told his tale. Little they understood, those two men, the tremendous force of courage which it took. Had they seen the rage into which the elder Thomas Riley had worked himself when he first discovered that his hard-earned money was worthless, had they heard his oft-repeated assurance that he would find out yet who gave the worthless rag to him, and the wretch should spend his life in jail, had they been aware of the careful teaching that, in calmer moments, he gave his boy, lest some one should catch him with bad money, they might have understood something of the terror and resolution of the brave little heart. As it was, Mr. Cady, who, you will remember, had been up all night, and had had his heart torn with fearful forebodings, had much ado not to laugh outright, and was yet not a little astonished to discover that his eyes were suddenly dim with tears. He turned abruptly away from Thomas. It would hardly do to let his small cash boy see such an unwonted sight. "I think I understand the matter fully," he said, speaking not unkindly. "You may go to your work. You shall hear from me later in the day." Thus dismissed, the little cash boy vanished, his heart almost too heavy to carry baskets of goods and moneys. Had his employer in the least understood the turmoil in the little fellow's heart, he would have said a word to set it to rest; or had the boy been older, he would not have been frightened anew by the tremor in the great man's voice. As it was, he went about fully expecting to spend the night in the lock-up, longing eagerly to ask somebody what would finally be done with him, and whether he might possibly be allowed to run home and see mother and kiss the baby before he went to jail. Robert Parks, much wondering why he was not summoned to the office for dismissal, tried to interest himself in his work, and at the same time determine what his chances for obtaining employment might be, provided he was dismissed without a character. He could hardly expect one, when he was suspected of dishonesty in word and deed. What if they should demand immediate payment of the note? Dr. Everett would lend him the money, but would he like to ask for it after last night? In all these ways he contrived to weary his brain. It was a wonder that he noticed Thomas Riley, but during the morning that young man managed to find time to shed a few tears, thus making his eyes red, as well as his cheeks and hair. "You in trouble too?" Robert asked, looking at him closely, as he lingered a moment near the desk, a wistful look in his eyes that Robert did not in the least understand. "Here," and he fumbled in his pocket and produced a red-cheeked apple, left from yesterday's lunch. "Take this and run away and munch it, and be happy." Very much astonished was he when Thomas, instead of reaching forth his hand for the apple, bestowed a mingled look of love and sorrow on the giver, burst into tears, and ran away. "Something the matter there that an apple won't cure," Robert said to himself with a sigh, and fell to moralizing a little about the amount of sorrow there was in the world. He knew nothing of Thomas. had not the least idea that he had the honor of being considered "father's friend," and was utterly unprepared for the heights of self-sacrifice which the boy had that morning climbed. Meantime, Mr. Wilson was dismissed from the chief's presence with only a little more ceremony than had been bestowed on Thomas. "I will not detain you longer at present, Mr. Wilson. I shall want to consult you later about several items of business. Meantime, with regard to this affair, you need give yourself no farther anxiety. I will see that it is settled. It is awkward, but nobody, perhaps, can really be said to be to blame. A careful attendance to our balance sheets will save any such awkwardness in the future." Whereupon Mr. Wilson bowed himself out, and tried to shut the door softly. He had an uncomfortable suspicion that he had been told that the blame of the whole matter attached to him. His zeal for his master's interest had suggested undue haste. This was hard, since his hair was gray, and he had been trying for 25 years to be faithful. But forgive Mr. Cady. He had a hard task before him. The young man to whom he had spoken so sharply but the evening before must receive an apology. Mr. Cady was not used to making apologies. Still, he was a gentleman. He did not so much dislike the idea of setting this young man right. The main difficulty lay in the fact that some public statement ought to be made. Here was the store so full of wild rumors over the trouble that the cash boys were talking about jails. Moreover, how was the man to forget certain plain words which were spoken to him in the gray dawn of morning by the man who had been the human means of saving the life of his child? Something must be done. Yet the morning wore away, every added hour of it but increasing the nervousness of both Robert and poor little Thomas, and nothing was done. At last, just as the early winter day was closing in around them, the great store had a sensation. Message after message of an unusual import was delivered at the different counters, until, by that mysterious witchcraft which seems to obtain in all stores, it became noised abroad that every clerk in the variety department had been summoned to the private office, Robert Parks among the number, and the call made the blood rush angrily over his face. He told himself that this was a little too much, to be publicly insulted. If Mr. Cady wanted to make an example of him, he should find that he had chosen the wrong person. He, Robert, would give all the rest of his life and every penny he could earn in proving to the world that he had been cruelly wronged by a man who called himself a Christian. But among all the cash boys who seemed on this particular afternoon to be swarming over the store, only one received a call to the office. Imagine the redness of Thomas Riley's cheeks and eyes by this time. I do not suppose that his hair really reddened any, and yet it seemed to. When the hushed company was seated, Mr. Cady opened the door of his inner office and entered. He looked around upon his guests with a curious air. They had never been summoned in this manner before. He could not help wondering what they thought, what they would think by the time he was through. Robert Parks's eyes were flashing. He was growing more angry every moment. "Young men," began Mr. Cady, his voice quiet and firm, "I shall not detain you long. I am aware that after a busy day at your posts you are not in the mood for long speeches, but I have a word to say that, in justice to one of your number, should be said in this public manner. I do not know how many of you have heard of the recent discrepancy which occurred in our cash account yesterday, but judging from reports which have come to me, I should say that the affair must have been very thoroughly discussed. I want now to say that while it was at no time supposed that your fellow clerk, Robert Parks, had been to blame, except for a departure from the strict rules of the store, it has transpired that he is absolutely without blame. I therefore take pleasure in publicly apologizing to him for any discomfort which may have arisen through this misunderstanding, and expressing my interest in his welfare and earnest desire and belief that his character in the future may be as honorable as it has been thus far in our employ. That you may all have opportunity to shake hands with and congratulate him on this happy termination of what was an annoyance, and what I am told some of you feared was a serious matter, I propose to excuse you from further duties today, and wish you all a pleasant evening. I will just say, however, before I forget it, that Thomas Riley may remain a moment after the rest. I have a word in private for him." Thus concluding what Mr. Cady was fond of remembering, long afterward, as the great speech of his life, he advanced to Robert Parks, and set the fashion of the hour by cordially shaking hands with him. Poor Thomas Riley! His terrors were added to 100-fold. Robert Parks was free, was being shaken hands with. No more fears for him. But what was to be done with his miserable self? As he stood there, quivering in every nerve, the room seemed to be whirling around. His eyes dimmed so that the astonished young men, passing out, looked like black specks dancing before his eyes. And but for the heavy table, with its rows and rows of drawers with great brass handles, to one of which he clung, I think Thomas Riley would have fallen. "My boy, do you know what a hero is?" It was Mr. Cady's voice that roused him from the dizzy darkness in which his frightened senses were whirling. It would never do to give way to dizziness and not answer Mr. Cady. He struggled with his voice. Yes, sir. Father told me once. It is a brave man who fights." "And sometimes it is a brave boy. I want you to run home and tell your father that he has a boy named Thomas who is a hero. And Thomas, it isn't a safe business to carry around counterfeit notes. They are apt to make trouble for us when we don't intend it. But I don't want you to lose your pleasure in your make-believe money. So I have decided to give you a good, clean, fresh note. It is yours to do what you like with. It will pass at any store or bank. But don't put it up your sleeve for safe keeping. And now, my boy, good night. You will not be needed this evening. You may go home and tell your mother I am pleased with you." End of chapter 18. Recording by Trisha G.